I want to begin this morning by talking about the literary device, the storytelling device of the Deus ex machina, which you may never have heard of. That's okay. It's Latin for the God from the machine. It's that moment in a story when something completely out of nowhere happens, something you couldn't have predicted or seen coming. The hero arrives just in time. The salvation unlooked for arrives. In my favorite books, of course, by Tolkien, it's The Eagles Are Coming. He uses that once in each of his stories. In the Silmarillion, the eagles arrive just in a moment to save one of the heroes. In The Hobbit, they arrive at the Battle of Five Armies. And of course, in The Return of the King, they arrive at the Battle of the Morannon. If you're a nerd like me, you know what I'm talking about. The rest of you, that's okay. That's his Deus ex machina. In my wife's favorite movie, Jurassic Park, it's when the velociraptors are cornering the heroes and they're about to eat our protagonists and these two kids, and the T-Rex jumps in and eats them, the velociraptors, instead. And you just think, well, that's convenient. That came out of nowhere. In War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells' classic tale, whatever version of it you're talking about, it's the fact that at the moment when humanity seems on the brink, all of the aliens fall over dead because germs got them, because they didn't have any immunity to our germs. Or perhaps one of the most ridiculous ones of all, in Superman, the movie, when Superman loses Lois Lane and gets so upset that he flies really fast around the world, and for some reason that makes no sense, it makes the world stop spinning and go backwards, and for another reason that makes no sense at all, time starts going backwards. You realize that time is not based on how fast the world is spinning, right? It's independent of the planet. When you go out in outer space, time continues. So that's very, very convenient that he's able to save Lois's life by flying really fast. I start with those because someone's going to pop into the middle of our story out of nowhere that we've never heard before. We don't know where he came from, and he's going to do an important thing and then be gone. It's quite the moment. Let's look at Genesis 14 and we'll see what leads up to that surprising moment. And my apology, there's a bunch of names, but I'm the one that has to read them, not you, so that's okay. At the time when Amraphel was king of Shinar, Arioch king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer king of Elam, and Tidal king of Goyim, these kings went to war against Bera king of Sodom, Bersha king of Gomorrah, Shinab king of Admah, Shemaber king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor. All these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is, the Dead Sea Valley. So last week when we were in chapter 13, we saw a family-centered episode where Abram demonstrated faith in God's promise to him by being generous to his nephew Lot. Here, in chapter 14, Abram will once again have the opportunity to display faith in God, this time on a much more consequential scale, because it's going to be right in the middle of a regional war. Who these kings are, where they come from, doesn't actually impact the narrative. Given how many of these locations in the ancient world are now uncertain, any attempt on our part to reconstruct what's happening here would be speculative and tentative. But it's really unnecessary. The concerns of these kings are not Abram's concerns. Why they chose to go to war, whether it was justified or not, does not concern Abram's future-oriented promises from God. And yes, I'm still calling him Abram. He won't be Abraham for a while yet. We're still waiting on that. There would be no reason to include these squabbles in Genesis if the conflict didn't spill over into Abram's family. Something we'll learn about in verse 12 when we get there. For now, we simply note that war has begun among the people that live near Abram and Lot. For 12 years, they'd been subject to, and his is the name I have to say the most, and I tried to figure out a variety of ways to pronounce it, and now I'm going to keep doing it differently probably every time. For 12 years, they've been subject to Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year, they rebelled. The text calls each of these 9 men involved kings, but they're more like chieftains. They're in charge of a town, except this guy, except Kedorlaomer, and I said it a different way that time, who up until this point had 8 of these kings as his vassals. In the ancient Near East, a system of suzerains and vassals developed with intricate webs of dominance and dependence. It really resembles how feudal Europe developed during the Middle Ages, where you had emperors and then kings and dukes and counts and earls and all the rest bound together through marriage alliances and oaths of loyalty, all revolving around the rights and the obligations that each of these nobles demanded of or owed to others. So this king, Kedorlaomer, must have been the most powerful at one point of this bunch, because 8 other kings pledged to ally themselves to him. They probably sent him yearly tribute, and they promised that if war broke out, they would each send a certain number of troops to fight with him. In exchange, he would have promised to protect them. Think of it like America's role in NATO. NATO is a mutual defense alliance, but America is the biggest partner in that. That's who this guy is. This arrangement lasted for 12 years until, for reasons we don't know and it doesn't actually matter, 5 of them said, yeah, that's enough of that. We don't want to be part of this relationship anymore. We're out. 3 of them remained loyal. Here's some more names. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him went out and defeated the Rephites in Ashtaroth Karnim, the Zuzites in Ham, the Emites in Sheva Kiriathaim, that's a tough one, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran near the desert. Then they turned back and went to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites, as well as the Amorites who were living in Hazazon Tamar. So this state of rebellion lasted for about 2 years until Kedorlaomer was ready to act, at which point he and his 3 loyal kings systematically began to crush the opposition in an effort to reassert his dominance over this region. Was he a kind or cruel overlord? Was he wise or foolish? The text doesn't offer any of the details we would need to evaluate these actions. All we know is that he was successful on the battlefield. History's full of leaders who were excellent generals. Some of them were incompetent rulers. Some of them were very skilled as a ruler. It didn't really, there's no real way of knowing. At this point, we don't have any reason to root for or against either side. There's no proverbial dog in the fight. And thinking about that, that's a horrible idiom because dogfights are a very bad thing. But you know what that means. Abram doesn't have a dog in the fight. The text of Genesis, we're wondering, why are we here? It's coming. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor, marched out and drew up their battle lines in the valley of Siddim against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. So at a certain point, those rebelling against Kedorlaomer needed to bow the knee again or unite and fight back. They chose to fight. There were 4 contingents of men against 5. But that doesn't tell us anything about how big each group was, about their training, their equipment, their motivation, their generalship. But the trend of events has been in Chedorlaomer's favor, and it would seem to make him the favorite. Let's see what happens. It says the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of the men fell into them, and the rest fled to the hills. There's no surprises here. The side that had been winning up until this point crushes the rebel side. The rebellion is effectively over, and the reestablishment of Chedorlaomer's prior dominance in this area seems to no longer have any real obstacles. It's done. The four kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food, then they went away. Chedorlaomer and his three loyal vassals, Amraphel, Arioch, and Tidal, now gather up the spoils of war, notably soon-to-be slaves, and whatever goods could be carried, and they head home victorious. At this point, this is the first time we had been reading Genesis, if we were unfamiliar with these stories, we would be wondering, why is this here? Why are we talking about these people? We don't know any of them. What possible concern could any of this be? History is full of stories like this. Why is this one included? Here's the reason. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. Now we know the reason that Genesis records this otherwise obscure bit of regional feuding. Lot and Abram went their own ways in the last chapter to avoid squabbling over grazing territory. But that doesn't make Lot any less family. How much time has slipped by since Lot moved near Sodom? It's been a few years, but we are not sure how long. Last time we saw him, he was living in a tent near the town. Sounds like maybe he's living in the city now, but we can't be sure. Presumably his wife and his two daughters were also taken into captivity by the victorious army of this alliance. They came to ransack the town after the winning the battle, and he happened to be caught up in the middle of it. Being on the wrong side of a lost battle or a war was one of the most common ways that people were forced into slavery in the ancient Near East. Certainly much less common than, say, being sold off by jealous older brothers. That doesn't happen as often, but we're heading to that story eventually. It says, a man who had escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. How will Abram respond to this news? We've every reason to believe that he loves his nephew Lot and his great nieces. But what can one man do? What can a stranger living in this land do about it? Well, he's wealthy. Maybe he will follow after and go to where Lot is taken to buy him back, to buy his freedom. He would be then his kinsman redeemer. That's a very powerful symbolic role in the Old Testament. Maybe that's what's going to happen. We'll wait and see. But note, this is the first time in the scriptures that we see the term Hebrew in Genesis. Today, the word is primarily used of the language spoken by Abraham's descendants. In the scriptures, Hebrew is also a synonym for their ethnicity. They are the Hebrews. It is one of the three terms that we will see for them. The other, of course, being the Jews and the Israelites. So if you see any of those terms, they are synonyms in the scriptures. Now Abram was living near the great tree of Mamre, the Amorite, a brother of Eshcol and Aner, all of whom were allied with Abram. It turns out that Abram has been making friends with some of his Amorite neighbors. In Joshua's day, God will forbid these bonds with the Canaanites because in that future generation, God's decree will be for the Israelites to fulfill his wrath against the wickedness of these peoples. But that's more than 500 years in the future from where Abraham is standing. At this point, God hasn't said to him anything about his neighbors and how he should interact with them, which means that Abram chose to build these relationships. Maybe it's mutual self-interest. We don't know how they developed. Whatever these bonds are that he has built and the promises that he and they have made to each other, now is the time that Abram is going to put those bonds to the test. Will his Amorite allies, maybe they're close enough to be called friends, will they stand with Abram when he needs their help? When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. We won't know until the last verse of this chapter, verse 24, but these 3 men, and presumably their whole households, did go with Abram to rescue Lot. And along with them are the 318 men in his household. That number is probably kind of surprising, isn't it? That's a lot of people. Now, none of these are his sons. He doesn't have one yet. He has a whole lot of servants, a whole lot of employees, a whole lot of people associated with him. Now, it doesn't feel like nearly enough to take on a victorious army. This is an army of 4 kings combined together, and he's going to go and fight them? That doesn't sound like a good idea. It's a good-sized group. They're going to have to pull off something unexpected. Here it is. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. If you divide an inferior force, that's risky business. It's considered unwise. So, of course, it's what history's most daring military geniuses do when they have to. To add to this risk that Abram took by splitting his smaller army into 2, Abram attacks at night, where all manner of mistakes can happen. One of your groups can get lost and never be part of the battle, or, as happened far too many times, you might end up fighting your own side in the middle of the night and not even know it. Night battles are extremely risky. Well, perhaps this victorious army was being careless. Maybe they didn't have guards out because they figured the battle's already over. Maybe they had gotten drunk after the battle and nobody was paying any attention. Whatever the circumstances, they were mistaken, because Abram and his allies rout the 4 kings' army and send them into headlong flight. Quickly, the hunters have become the hunted, and all the previous victories that we read about have basically been negated. Abram recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, and together with the women and the other people. The key was getting Lot and his family back alive. That's why Abram's here. That's what his main and really primary concern is. Abram and his men rescued a bunch of other folks who no doubt appreciated the sudden reversal of their fortunes. Note that they recovered all the loot that had been plundered along with the people that they rescued. That'll be important later on. It says, after Abram returned from defeating Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley. Now that's the same king whose army was just soundly defeated, right? He must have had a faster horse than his enemies because he was able to run away. Now, here he is again. This is the same king whose town was ransacked, whose people were taken off into slavery. The same king whose people Abram has just rescued. Hold that thought, because we're not going to get back to him till verse 21. Before that, here comes our wholly unexpected visitor, and he is about to take center stage. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Who? From where? Now, Salem we recognize because we know it from the longer version of the name, Jerusalem, as it will be known in the future. Although this is the first mention of that city, of course, that city will become the center of worship of the God of Abraham, the capital of the Davidic dynasty, the site of Solomon's temple. But that is many generations in the future when Moses is writing these events down. We see foreshadowing when we hear that Melchizedek is king of Salem, because we know about all that about Jerusalem. That connection was not known in Moses' day. His audience, the Israelites in Sinai, would not have made any symbolic connection because this man is from Salem. Now, we've already heard a lot of names of local kings in this chapter. None of them have had any particular connection to Abram's story or to God's promises until right now. The name Melchizedek is certainly new as well. We don't know anything about his past or any prior connection he may have made to Abram. But he came to see Abram after the battle. Why? Here's why. He was priest of God Most High. Say what now? He was priest of God. A priest outside of Abram's family. A priest 600 years or so before the law was given at Sinai. Yes, and yes, he's both of those. This news comes out of nowhere. Reading Genesis this far, we've had no idea that God has been working beyond the promise that he made to Abram, that he has other people that he's working with. And we have no idea that a priestly function could exist at this point in history, because God hasn't given it definition and purpose yet, like he will with the Levites and Aaron's line and say, do this, do it this way. None of that exists yet. So we need to ask ourselves when we hear that he's priest of God Most High, how did this start? What is the purpose of him being a priest of God? How does it fit with God's plan that is unfolding through Abram? We read this morning the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews devotes a significant amount of time and space to connecting Melchizedek and his unexpected priesthood to Jesus' role as the great high priest. And Psalm 7 also refers back to him. But Genesis itself will make no attempt to explain what is happening here. In fact, the narrative of Genesis acts as if this turn of events is no surprise at all. At least not to Abram, which leads us to ponder important questions that unfortunately do not have definitive answers, but the questions are worth asking. How many other people before and after Abram did God have a relationship with like that of Melchizedek? Were any of these people outside of the Promised Land, or was it just here locally? Were any of them outside of the Near East? How did God establish these relationships? Did he speak with them? Did he send them visions, dreams, angelic messengers, prophets? Honestly, we don't even know that basic information about Melchizedek. We don't know how his story got started, let alone if there are other people and what their story might be. So what do we know? It's important to recap that sometimes. What do we know? Number one, we know this. God's mercy and God's desire to redeem the lost time and time again exceed our expectations. God reaches people and places that we have no idea he's doing anything in, and yet there his grace is. God is at work beyond our expectations. That is one thing that we know. Second thing we know is this. The Word of God, while extensive, it's a fairly thick book, contains only a tiny fraction of the stories of God's work here on earth. In each generation that we might want to talk about, God is always doing much more than is recorded in inspired Scripture. Third thing we know is that, speculation aside, we know that God's unrecorded or unknown work with humanity will always be consistent with what is known and recorded. Because God himself is consistent in his character, in his purpose, in his will. So with all of that taken together, Melchizedek isn't actually a surprise at all, because God is God of the whole earth and all of its peoples. We may have assumed that his only work was with Abram and his descendants who are his chosen people. But God is the creator of us all. God is the father of us all. God cares about all the world's people. So we shouldn't be surprised that God was doing something beyond Abraham. And we shouldn't be surprised that what he is doing is very consistent with what he's doing with Abraham. So what is going on here? Let's keep going. He is priest of God Most High. He blessed Abram, saying. So the unanswerable questions of how, when, and why Melchizedek became a priest of God Most High, let's set those aside because we don't know. He is a priest of God. In that role newly introduced to the story of Genesis, Melchizedek blesses Abram. Think about that. Abram is the one chosen by God to be the future of a great nation, to be its father. God promised to bless those who bless Abram and curse those who curse him. God even promised to bless the whole world someday through this man. And yet, Abram is about to receive and respond positively to the notion that Melchizedek has the right and the authority to bless him in this priestly role. We already saw that Abram has the same problems in life as his neighbors. We saw that when the famine forced him to make hard choices and go sojourn in Egypt like everyone else. We saw from his failure to live by faith there that Abram could fail just like the rest of humanity. Here we learn another important lesson about Abram. It's the realization that Abram is not above being blessed by another human being whom God had chosen to fulfill that role. It's a lesson in humility. Now that humility will be repeated about 2,000 years from now in very similar fashion when Jesus goes to the Jordan to be baptized by John. Jesus could have said, "John, man, please, I'm the guy in charge here." And that was John's attitude too. He's like, no, come on, seriously. Abram could have said to Melchizedek, "Please, I'm the chosen one. If anyone's doing blessings, it'll be me." But he didn't. Just like the humility Jesus shows when he says, "Hey, I may be the Son of God, Emmanuel, God in the flesh, but I'll be baptized." And then he takes it a step further near the end of his life when he washes his disciples' feet. Tremendous example of humility here when Abram receives this blessing from this priest. Here's the blessing. "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." The blessing itself repeats what we already know. No need to break new ground with it. Sometimes the classics work best. They're certainly classic for a reason. Abram is indeed blessed by God. We saw that back in chapter 12. And God is indeed worthy of praise. Both of those go without saying. The one bit of new information here is that God is responsible for Abram's victory. We probably assumed that already because it's the standard element in the lives of Joseph and Moses and Joshua and Gideon and David and Elijah and Esther and on and on. We always see God intervening, involving himself, often in literal battles, to uphold his people. But this is the first time we've seen God do so in Genesis. We've seen the first example of what will become a foundational part of his relationship with his people moving forward. Here is the kicker. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. This is the mic drop moment, if you will. Abram gave a tithe, a tenth of the spoils of battle to Melchizedek, because he is God's representative. He's a priest of God. He represents God. And so giving him a tenth is a way to acknowledge this claim that God provided the victory. Abram knew that it was true. God gave the victory. He didn't try to claim, hey, man, I was the one that came up with the plan here. I was the one that rallied the troops and gave them that speech. No. Abram realizes God gave the victory. And so here he willingly affirms his dependence upon God by formally offering God, through his representative, a tenth. That's incredible stuff. Oh yeah, this guy's still here. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." The unexpected appearance of Melchizedek caused the narrative to forget that the king of Sodom was also here for a while. Abram's done him a huge service. By any cultural standard, this man is deeply in Abram's debt. So he does what is sensible by offering all of the recovered property to Abram, on the condition that the people of Sodom be freed. Now remember, this king of Sodom's army has already been defeated. He's in no position to dictate terms to Abram. But these are fairly generous terms if, and here is the key, if Abram wants to be his friend or his ally moving forward. Now, we know Abram's not against making allies and having friends in the area. What will he do here? But Abram said to the king of Sodom, with raised hand I have sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. Abram firmly rejects the offer. He formally rescinds any perceived claim that he might have to this loot. Moreover, Abram seals this pledge with an oath to God, a very serious thing. It seems clear that Abram feels very strongly about this. He has no desire to ally himself with the king of Sodom. Why? Abram doesn't want people to think that the king of Sodom is his benefactor, nor that he built his wealth on the misfortune of Sodom in war. Long story short, he doesn't want to be publicly associated with this king. Abram's here to save Lot, his kinsman, not to choose sides in this regional squabble. The primary reason would be, of course, their reputation for wickedness. Along with it is the acknowledgement cemented back in verses 18 to 20 that God is the one that is the source of Abram's strength. We'll end with this. I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who went with me to Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them have their share. As we noted back in verse 13, Abram's dependence upon God did not prevent him from making mutual promises of support to his three Amorite neighbors. Earthly alliances are not precluded by heavenly ones. They're just always secondary to them. So Abram didn't speak for his friends when it came to the spoils. If they want their share, they're welcome to it. But Abram has already honored God with a tenth and rejected personal gain in this episode. For him, rescuing Lot is the sufficient reward. And for that, he has already praised God. 4 quick things for you to take from this text as to help you remember it. Number 1, power struggles, even wars among men can affect God's people, whether they want to have anything to do with them or not. In this case, Lot found himself in the middle of it, and Abram had to join it. They didn't want to be, but there it was. People in our world today have that exact same issue. They didn't ask for war, but war found them anyway. Number 2, Abram responded to his kinsman Lot's distress by acting boldly in faith. That's a good lesson. 3, God's plans and purposes extend further than we know. They do so in keeping with his character and promises. We learned that from Melchizedek. And then lastly, Melchizedek gave Abram an opportunity to demonstrate his gratitude to God for giving him the victory, something Abram gladly took advantage of so he could honor his God. Let's have a word of prayer before we go into communion for the situation in Israel